Hi, I'm David Miller, and this is the fourth in a series of mini lectures on Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Today we'll talk about character and setting, and then we'll go on next time to map the action of the play. Here are the topics for today's mini lecture, and as you see, we're starting with a contrast between this play and Romeo and Juliet. The reason for that is that these two plays are curiously connected. They were written and performed at about the same time. Chronology of Shakespeare's plays is never quite certain, but both of these are thought to be from 1595. One is a tragedy and the other a comedy, but both are stories of young love thwarted, and in fact the plot of Romeo and Juliet appears distorted but easily recognizable in the tragical mirth of Pyramus and Thisbe, while the atmosphere and setting of A Midsummer Night's Dream seep into Romeo and Juliet in Mercutio's famous Queen Mab speech. One major difference between the two plays involves setting. Romeo and Juliet takes place almost entirely in Verona. The one contrasting locale, Mantua, where we briefly visit Romeo in exile, is essentially a non-place. Its defining characteristic is that it's not Verona. The exclusivity of the setting in this play is appropriate to its tragic form. Romeo and Juliet have literally nowhere to go outside the city walls of Verona. The rest of the world doesn't exist for them. A Midsummer Night's Dream, by contrast, is all about escape. Athens is an oppressive environment for young lovers. With the clarity of a fairy tale, the play makes explicit the patriarchal dogma that was usually a bit more veiled in Elizabethan England. Your father should be as a god, and the penalty for disobedience is death. And so the young lovers flee the city. They believe they are headed for Lysander's dowager aunt, 7 leagues away. Just think if Romeo had had one of those. But we never see that dowager, who exists in the play only as an idea. Instead, the young lovers find themselves lost in the woods at night. Now, there was an old English folk custom called maying, and from that custom we can get a feel for the associations that fleeing into the countryside would have for Elizabethan audiences. Here, for example, is a woodcut contrasting life in town with what goes on in the countryside. The townspeople, as you see, are engaging in productive labor. Out in the countryside, they are paired off into couples surrounding a giant-sized Cupid. I think that crowned female in the lower right corner is probably the May Queen. Even the topography looks erotic, all pillowy and curvaceous, in contrast to the flat surfaces and straight lines of the town. To put it simply then, venturing into the countryside signifies coupling. Here's a ballad that elaborates on the theme. It starts out by telling us that the fine lasses go maying in order to gather flowers, but eventually it gets to the real point, bringing in the young men for an episode of sexual license. That great joying is identified pretty clearly by the closing reference to a green gown. Any idea what that is? No need to prolong the suspense. Here's a woodcut that removes all doubt. There's all sorts of boundary crossing going on out there in the countryside. In one clear sense, then, the woods in this play are the opposite of Athens by daylight. If Athens stands for law, authority, and rational control over the passions, the woods stand for sexual license, rebellion against authority, and the eerie intensity of dreams. But if the woods and city are opposites, they are also mirror images of each other. And in the end, the young lovers of A Midsummer Night's Dream do not escape to a different location. They return to Athens, where they find both themselves and the city transformed by the power of the dream. The parallel and contrast between these two settings is reinforced by the way the characters are grouped. We can start with the older generation, for the city and the woods are ruled by couples who not only mirror one another, but actually have some history. Oberon and Hippolyta have been lovers. Titania refers to her scornfully as the bouncing Amazon. as have Theseus and Titania. This is why each is in the neighborhood to bless the wedding of the former human favorite. Oberon and Titania are quarreling openly. Theseus and Hippolyta sound a lot more amicable, but as we saw in the first mini-lecture on the play's opening lines, there are veiled hints of a power struggle between the bride and groom. This subtext of conflict can easily be pointed up on stage, and film versions have sometimes made them explicit. Here, for example, is a pair of screenshots from what is still the best film version ever made of this play, a 1935 production that featured performances by Mickey Rooney as Puck and James Cagney, you heard me right, as Bottom. The amazing cast of that film included Dick Powell as Lysander, Olivia de Havilland as Hermia, and Joe E. Brown as Flute. The plight of Hermia, which quickly takes center stage in the opening scene, makes all too clear the element of triumph that lurks beneath the surface of the Duke's anticipated reveling. Technically, a triumph was the term for a Roman military procession in which a victorious general returning home would parade conquered kings and queens before the commoners. Mixing that kind of ceremony with preparations for a wedding sounds like a recipe for disaster. Hermia's thwarted rebellion against her father's authority also, of course, finds a parallel in Titania's resistance to the demands of Oberon. We notice, too, that the older couples have changed partners in the past, just as the young lovers do in the forest under the influence of the love and idleness juice. The one exception to this pattern is worth noticing, though, for it isn't perfectly symmetrical. Hippolyta has dallied with Oberon and Titania with Theseus, but in the woods it is only the male wooers whose affections bounce back and forth. Hermia and Helena are constant in their affections to the young men, if not to each other. It's an old cultural bias that treats infidelity as excusable, if not indeed inevitable, for men, but not for women, unless they are supernatural beings or Amazon warrior queens. This coding of infidelity as a masculine privilege runs parallel to the power struggles between men and women in the play. In contrast to these struggles over male dominance, the play offers us several images of shared, exclusively female space. These include the relationships I mentioned last time between Titania and her Indian votress, and between Hermia and Helena, along with the notion of an Amazon realm. Notice, however, that none of these relationships between women survive. The Amazons are defeated, the votress dies in childbirth, and Helena recalls the image of her childhood friendship with Hermia in the course of accusing her bitterly of betrayal. These patterns in the character groupings help to develop and enrich the contrasts between city and forest, and the same is true of the mechanicals and fairies. I mentioned last time that they're both symbolic children, which means that in a way they offer a contrast to generational conflict, being themselves harmless and obedient. This parallel is reinforced by the fact that the names of these characters identify them as metonymic bits of the social or natural world. In this way, they are closely tied to their respective locations. Metonymy is the figure of speech that gives something the name of something else associated with it, as when we say the White House to mean the current presidential administration. The mechanicals all have metonymical names based on their trades. Bottom, for example, is a weaver, and while Shakespeare manages to pun on just about every meaning of the word, it does refer to the piece of wood on which thread was wound. As the mechanicals are to the social world of trade in the city, so the fairies are to the woods. If the mechanicals are personified trades, the fairies are animated bits of nature, mustard seed, cobweb, peas blossom. If the play's couples and their relationships are linked to the contrasting settings of Athens and the forest, the fairies and mechanicals make this kind of connection explicit. In them, character and setting meet. So much for the settings and character groupings. It's a complicated pattern, but the parallels and contrasts are all pretty clear, and they fit together nicely. Next time, we'll go on to map the action of the play.